Hello, everyone. My name is Destiny Benjamin, and I'd like to welcome you to the Black Friday Conversations broadcast. We thank each and every one of you for joining us on this Friday afternoon. While you are here, let's comment your both city and state that you are watching from. We'd love to know. In the meantime, I am going to tell you a little bit about the Black Friday Conversations. Although many see conversations about the economic progress of Black people as a liberal issue in contrast to a conservative issue, we do not hold this view. We view Black people as a unique and valuable entity, and our history and destiny are too deep and wide to fit within the corner of any particular political ideology. We aim to have challenging and constructive conversations with most, whether liberal or conservative, who seek the welfare and well-being of Black people. Now, please stay tuned for the following video to learn more.
America has become the greatest picture of capitalism in the history of the world. America is known for having created more millionaires, billionaires, and self-sufficient people than all other countries combined. If that weren't enough, America has done this in record time. It's been said that the Protestant work ethic, the concept of morality, and the free enterprise system make up the equation that produced our success. Although these are real concepts in American history, they don't tell the whole story. They are part of our mythology, but they mask our full history. African slavery is rarely mentioned as an important part of America's economic history. African slavery is mythologized as a marginal institution of benevolent slave masters, but had very little impact on America's economic future. This is embarrassingly false. The historical record, filled with hundreds of thousands of letters, contracts, accounting records, court documents, personal wills, and succession speeches, tell a far different story. Cotton, which was the #1 export of the 19th century, that grew the Industrial Revolution exponentially, was driven by slave labor. Banking and credit systems were perfected through slave, cotton, and land financing. Millions of acres of land were cleared and cultivated by Black people. Many renowned academic institutions were endowed in whole or in part by revenue generated from slave labor. These numbers don't even take into account the hundreds of billions of dollars of economic opportunity African Americans were locked out of in the South between 1877 to 1964. America is the capitalistic juggernaut it is today in large part because Black people were the invisible hand in the equation.
Hello again, everyone. I'd like to once again welcome you and welcome all of our viewers from both Facebook, the website, and YouTube. We thank you once again for being with us today. Now, I'm going to read an excerpt from my blog titled What's Our Destiny? The essay is also titled Still We Rise. I wrote this essay in response to an English teacher's suggestion to observe hopelessness and hopefulness in the Black community, as well as in connection to a lesson I taught in my African American literature class. The excerpt reads as follows. I taught using a combination of Ralph Ellison's concept of invisibility, W.E.B. Du Bois' definition of double consciousness, and Alan Locke's New Negro philosophy. I described that there are two paths a Black person in America can pursue in response to their afflictions. One path leads towards invisibility, and the other path towards the New Negro mentality. Of course, the choice is only revealed after the recognition that every Black person is in a state of double consciousness. Du Bois explains that the Negro is born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Once we, as Black Americans, become aware that our skin color changes how the world perceives us, typically through a first or second-hand racist encounter, we subconsciously choose a path to pursue, one towards hopelessness and rejection of the racial repercussions of Blackness, and the other towards hopefulness of a better future and acceptance that the racial repercussions of Blackness will not have a negative influence on shaping our identity. The narrator of Invisible Man chose the path of invisibility, evident through the title, after enduring many racially motivated difficulties in his life. While seeking success in education, he frequently faced discrimination that upended his life and caused detours in his plans. Each instance leads the narrator towards the state of double consciousness, and the hopelessness that resulted pushed him into a life of invisibility. Though this path can feel like the easier option, the narrator still dealt with internal conflicts with his identity that sometimes led to violent encounters with white people. The danger of the path of invisibility is that no one else recognizes it but you. So even if you reject your Blackness, the world will still see it and treat you accordingly. Now the essay goes on to observe the other paths that Black people can take in America. However, you can read more if you go to www.what'sourdestiny.com. And you can also follow it on both Facebook and Instagram at What's Our Destiny. At this time, we will have another video begin in just a moment.
America has become the greatest picture of capitalism in the history of the world. America is known for having created more millionaires, billionaires, and self-sufficient people than all other countries combined. If that weren't enough, America has done this in record time. It's been said that the Protestant work ethic, the concept of morality, and the free enterprise system make up the equation that produced our success. Although these are real concepts in American history, they don't tell the whole story. They are part of our mythology, but they mask our full history. African slavery is rarely mentioned as an important part of America's economic history. African slavery is mythologized as a marginal institution of benevolent slave masters, but had very little impact on America's economic future. This is embarrassingly false. The historical record, filled with hundreds of thousands of letters, contracts, accounting records, court documents, personal wills, and succession speeches, tell a far different story. Cotton, which was the #1 export of the 19th century, that grew the Industrial Revolution exponentially, was driven by slave labor. Banking and credit systems were perfected through slave, cotton, and land financing. Millions of acres of land were cleared and cultivated by Black people. Many renowned academic institutions were endowed in whole or in part by revenue generated from slave labor. These numbers don't even take into account the hundreds of billions of dollars of economic opportunity African Americans were locked out of in the South between 1877 to 1964. America is the capitalistic juggernaut it is today in large part because Black people were the invisible hand in the equation.
All right, so at this time, we will be preparing for our first speaker of the afternoon, my father, Mr. Marcus Benjamin. His bio is as follows. Marcus Benjamin is an award-winning corporate speaker and consultant who speaks across the country in various corporate, civic, and faith-based events, which he has done for over 20 years. His parent company, Benjamin Consulting Group, manages his family of brands, which include Gravitas Advising and Planning, the Benjamin Agency, and Living in the Black. Marcus has personally provided coaching, speaking, and consulting services to companies ranging from startups to $1 billion in annual revenue. Marcus graduated from Winthrop University with a degree in business, the Quantic School of Business with an executive MBA, and the University of Sydney with a certification in design strategy. Additionally, Marcus is a certified emotional intelligence practitioner for executive leaders. Now, please welcome Mr. Marcus Benjamin.
Destiny, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm smiling. I'm excited that you're on with us today. And right before I pull you off the screen and I'll share for a few moments before we bring up Dr. Edward Baptist, I wanted to let everyone know Destiny she's read my bio and she's going to read Dr. Baptist's bio shortly. But Destiny is an honors student at one of the top and most rigorous schools in South Carolina, the Governor's School for Science and Math. She is going to college somewhere. She has narrowed her list down to 5. She has been accepted to 4 of her 5 schools. She's waiting for she's been accepted to 5. I thought, well,
I've accepted to 5. I'm waiting for 4 more.
She's waiting for 4 more. And she has been accepted to the Honors College at one college I won't name. I know she doesn't want any names going out there yet, so we'll leave that to her. But she is a brilliant young lady. She played varsity basketball since she was in the 7th grade. And so not only is she a brainiac, but she's also a baller as well. Again, she's here today as the founder of whatsyourdestiny.com, which is a blog that endeavors to bring hope and strategy to Black people by helping them realize what has happened, challenging issues of white supremacy, and pointing us toward a hopeful future. So again, I want to challenge everyone to go to her blog, whatsyourdestiny.com, and check that out. So Destiny, thank you very much. I know you'll be back in a few moments,
Yes.
but thank you very much for what you've done so far.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's Marcus Benjamin, and I get the opportunity today to sort of set the stage, sort of provide some context regarding the Black Friday conversations. You know, I know many of you that are on YouTube that are watching us on Facebook, and also that are watching us at the blackfridayconversations.com website. Many of you have already been a part of our past conversations that we've had. And we endeavor to bring thought leaders, thinkers, people who can provoke, who can challenge, people who aren't necessarily given over to a particular political ideology. Not that, you know, people can choose whatever party they want and whatever political approach that they want. But the goal of the Black Friday conversations is really to bring people of goodwill to a conversation that may be challenging for quote unquote liberals, that may be challenging for quote unquote conservatives, but ultimately it's designed to bring a conversation, a healthy conversation where people can understand the past, manage the present, and also direct toward a more purposeful future. So that's sort of the essence of the Black Friday conversation. If you want to find out more about it, you can go to blackfridayconversations.com and you can find out a whole lot more about why these conversations exist. Let me give you another point of reference. You will find a little bit more about it in the video in a few moments, but when we reference these conversations and these tough conversations that we're bringing up, and we reference Black people or white people or things like that, do understand that in most cases, we're painting with a broad stroke of the brush. that we do understand there were some great white folks of history and white people of history who have been allies to African Americans before we were recognized as citizens, during that process, and afterwards. So we trust that those of you who are new to this conversation aren't offended by those statements. It's just simply the reality of our history. And we're having that conversation from a heart desiring to create courageous conversations and ultimately direct us toward a purposeful end. But understand, sometimes it's difficult to do that without addressing ugly issues of the past. I'm gonna say it again. Sometimes it's difficult to do that without addressing ugly issues of the past. And to that end, I want to begin my presentation today. My presentation is going to last for approximately 25 minutes. So like, share on whatever platform you're watching. And then Destiny will come back and she will introduce Dr. Baptist. He will share a keynote. And then afterwards, we're going to have a very robust Q&A regarding his content. So what I want to begin with today is a graphic, and that graphic is what I call the social progress cycle. I want to begin with this graphic, the social progress cycle. I really want us to have a conversation surrounding this because the social progress cycle, we feel, provides a measurable framework that we can use historically, that we can use in the present, and that we can use in the future in order to map what's really happening in societies. Now, why is this important? I've said this for years, and I'm certainly not the first person who said it. And I'll be going back and forth between this graphic. I'm not the first person who said it. But when you look at American history, when you look at the people who have come to America to create this country as great as it is at the present, when you look at the immigrants who've come to this country, when you look at, again, the original founders who came to this country, and then when you look at Black people who were brought to this country, there's a key difference. There's a very key and important difference in all of those groups. And Destiny referenced it in her blog that she read from earlier. You ready for it? That key word, that key difference is hope. Yes, it's hope. Let's go back to that graph and look at it again. The beginning of social progress in any community, in any society, in any location, the beginning of social progress is hope. Hopeful people respond a certain way. Hopeless people respond a different way. The social progress cycle begins with hope. And when you have hope, then you have personal agency. The immigrants who came to this country, the founders who were a part of and founded this country, they came to America with hope. The hope of a better life, the hope of a better future, the hope of better economics, the hope of longer life. Hope filled their heart. Ladies and gentlemen, African Americans, Black people were not brought to this country in hope. Black people were brought to this country in fear. Not only brought here in fear, but cultivated over a century and a half of fear. Think about that for a second. The primary emotion that drives social progress is hope. And the African Americans who were brought to this country were brought here void of hope. They were brought here in fear, cultivated in fear, social engineering in fear. Why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this context up for you because, again, hope creates personal agency. Now, when we say personal agency, what we really mean is a person has a sense of my actions can actually improve the outcomes in my life. They have a sense of ambition. They have a sense of progress and progression and productivity because they really feel as if their actions can influence positive outcomes in their life. So you see them starting businesses, cultivating farms, building houses, so on and so forth, because of personal agency. So hope gives birth to personal agency, right? Now, personal agency doesn't guarantee success, but what it does is it puts you in an environment of tension. Now, why did I bring up tension? I bring up tension because it doesn't matter how much hope you have or how much personal agency you have. You're going to experience tension when you're endeavoring to what? Create social progress, economically, educationally, academically, philosophically, whatever kind of progress you want to bring. Tension is a part of progress. Why? Because there is a state that was, and there is a state that should be. Let me say that again. There's a state that was, and there's a state that should be. And the tension between the two is you have the tension between what was or what is and what you want it to be. And that tension is palpable. That tension is there. It's real. It's real. But when a person progresses through that tension, hope, personal agency, and tension, guess what happens? They encounter progress. You see it right there on the screen? They encounter progress. Hope gives birth to personal agency. Personal agency gives birth to tension. That tension between what is and what should be creates progress. And guess what happens when you have progress? You create more hope as you see that. When you experience progress, you experience more hope, then you experience more personal agency, more tension, more progress, more hope, more personal agency, more tension, more progress. I hope you see the cycle. Now, I want to spend my remaining 10 to 12 minutes talking about the progress part of this cycle. Because when we deal with, again, economics, and when we deal with economy, microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics, in most cases, again, this social progress cycle is driving all of it. But macroeconomics, which is, overview economics, bird's eye view economics, it's national economics, global economic principles, and so forth. Listen to me very carefully. Macroeconomics cannot happen without institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, I need you to understand what I just said. Microeconomics can happen without institutions. That's me going out in the year 1820 and desiring to cultivate my farm, cultivate my field, grow wheat or tobacco or cotton or whatever it was. That's me. But macroeconomics cannot happen without creating institutions. Now, why is that important? Let's go back to the graphic. Because at the progress phase of the social progress cycle, hope, personal agency, tension, and progress, at the progress stage, that's where institutions are created. Institutions are created at the personal progress stage, and those institutions are created to protect the progress that was made and promote more personal agency. Let me say it again. Institutions were created to protect the progress that was made and to promote more personal agency. Now, when these institutions are created and established and they're supported and upheld by legislation, they're upheld by economics, so on and so forth, guess what it does? It protects progress from premature failure. So when you go back into American history, you think about all of the institutions that we've created in our society that's designed to protect progress and to promote more progress. All of the government bureaucracies that were created, all of these institutions were created. And just think about for a moment that Black people were left out of those institutions, except for the fact that we were commodities within those institutions to be used by slave owners to further their own progress. And then think about this in my final remaining minutes. After the Civil War, after a very brief period of Reconstruction, Black codes in the South, Jim Crow South, all of those concepts created a barrier that kept Black people from engaging in and profiting from the institutions of the South that unfortunately our white brothers and sisters profited off of substantially. We could talk about redlining. We could talk about the prison industrial complex. We can talk about radical policing and police reform. We can talk about these institutions that we are now dealing with here in the 21st century that were created and supported and designed to keep Black people from experiencing the progress that was happening in the broader society. So in my remaining 2 minutes here, this is what I want you to zero in on. This is what I really want you to take away from this component. Without hope, nothing happens. You know, it wasn't a dream in the night that caused former President Barack Obama to have a theme for his campaign, hope and change. Hope and change. That wasn't some dream in the night. That wasn't just something he was sitting around thinking about. And I came up with a great idea. No, of course, there are people who are paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to design campaign slogans and themes, because that concept of hope is what drives society. Now, for the purpose of this conversation, it's not designed to talk about whether or not he was successful or not. I'm simply making a point to say that hope is the genesis of all progress. No progress happens without hope, but hope gives birth to personal agency. When you look at areas where there's high crime, high poverty, etc., guess what you find? A hopeless people. You find people who are low in hope. But what happens when you see areas of productivity, progress, development, etc.? You find a hopeful people. You find people who are filled with hope. And so I want to zero in on that, on this conversation, because African Americans were excluded from the social progress cycle for 349 years. I want you to let that sink in for a moment. So now in the present day, in 2021, in February 2021, what do we do? Marcus, what is our response? Well, we're going to get into a lot of that in a few moments in the Q&A. But what I want to zero in on is I want to ask you the question: where does your hope come from? Where does your sense of hope come from? Does your sense of hope come from who is the president or who's not the president? Does your sense of hope come from your degree of education or lack thereof? Does your sense of hope come from the family you were raised in and how they inspired you, or in what they imparted into you, or not? Where does your hope come from? Because if you want to change your community, if you want to change your society, if you want to change your family, all progress begins with hope. And I wanted to some extent, delineate that in this session, in this introductory session, so that you can begin to see how the absence of hope stripped Black people of what they should have had. But through the possession of hope, referencing back to Destiny's blog, the possession of hope, the presence of hope, can lead us to a place of significance. It can affect policy. Yes, it can affect policy and legislation. But before it affects policy and legislation, it has to first affect your house, your heart, and your life. And so I'm going to bring a conclusion to my part. I'm going to play a brief video. And then after that video, Destiny Benjamin will be returning back to continue this conversation, to introduce our keynote speaker. I'm Marcus Benjamin, and I've had some amazing mentors in my life. And quite honestly, two of the most significant mentors in my life were white men. One of them was my first boss when I was a banker, and the other one is a business owner and pastor from Virginia. You see, that business owner and pastor in Virginia, our relationship started by him asking me a question: Marcus, help me understand what it is and what it means and what it feels like to be Black in America. I'm a white man. I've had a different experience. I want to understand your experience. You see, that type of conversation opens the door to understanding, because Black people and white people haven't had the same experience in America historically. And contrary to popular opinion, our experience is categorically different even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What am I saying? When I use white people, when I talk about systemic racism and so forth, this is not a liberal conversation or a conservative conversation. It's a sacred conversation that unfortunately has been mismanaged. It's been ignored by one party and maybe even manipulated by the other. The point that I'm simply making is this. The concept of Black identity, Black equality, economically and socially, unfortunately, was a sacred issue, and it still is a sacred issue. It is a sacred issue. It's a sacred issue because historically, white folks used the Bible and sacred values to bring about their level of superiority and Black inferiority. So when I say white people or systemic racism or white privilege, I'm not talking liberal and I'm not talking conservative. I'm simply using words that most people understand in this conversation. And I'm endeavoring to create a context. What we don't understand is that the concepts of white supremacy, white superiority, Black inferiority, systemic racism, those conversations were created because of concepts derived from a mishandling of scripture, a mishandling of sacred values. That unfortunately white folks use the Bible to establish their superiority and to establish Black inferiority. See, this conversation is a sacred conversation, but we
Hello, everyone. I am back before you. I'd like to first thank Mr. Benjamin. I hope you all were inspired by his words, and I encourage you to put some of your takeaways in the comment section on the premise that hope is the gateway to progress. While you do so, I will read the bio of Dr. Edward Baptist as we prepare for his discussion. Edward Baptist grew up in Durham, North Carolina, received his undergraduate degree from Georgetown University and his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. At Cornell, he is the professor in the Department of History. Together with faculty colleagues from 4 other universities, Baptist leads Freedom on the Move at freedomonthemove.org, a collaborative effort to build a crowdsourced database of all North American fugitive slave ads. Among his publications is the 2014 book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery in the Making of American Capitalism. Now please give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Edward Baptist.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the introduction, and thanks so much to Marcus and Destiny, Benjamin, and all of you for having me on here. I've got a slideshow, and I'm going to try to share it with you so that I can jump right in and give us plenty of time, hopefully, for discussion. So let's see. All right. So let me know if the sharing isn't working or something like that. But what I wanted to talk about really briefly today, I'm going to zip through a number of slides, but hopefully give us some interesting things to discuss. But I want to focus on some of my research, which gets to the question that I think Mr. Benjamin was talking about earlier of slavery's ongoing legacies. And I'm in particular interested today in talking about 3 that I spend some time researching on. Wealth extraction, racialized policing, and then the response, a response of solidarity, the building of solidarity, and processes of resistance and organization. So those are the 3 topics I'm going to try to hit in this discussion. And Mr. Benjamin mentioned, and Destiny mentioned my 2014 book. And this one focuses much more on the, at least more obviously on the wealth extraction side. And I do focus on cotton and specifically on the expansion of cotton production in the U.S. From the time right after the revolution where the U.S. is essentially growing no cotton, but cotton is coming into large scale demand with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the factory system in Britain to 1860, by which time the U.S. for more than a generation has been the monopoly supplier of cotton on the world market, making something like 90% of all the cotton that's sold in Western Europe, and 100% of the cotton that's sold in the United States, which has its own factory system by that point. And virtually all of that cotton that was getting sold on the world market, and by the way, that was over 50% of all the exports from the United States was cotton. Virtually all of that cotton that comes out of the United States is made in the American South by enslaved African Americans. You can see from this map that there's a shift in where cotton is grown. There's also a corresponding shift in the population of enslaved African Americans from the kind of earliest beginnings of slavery in the coastal areas of the South until by 1860, you have both cotton growing and the Black population in the U.S. being heavily concentrated across the entire region from the Carolinas all the way to East Texas. This is a major shift. It is made possible by the movement of slave owners who move enslaved people with them, but also by slave traders who are buying African American enslaved people from owners in Virginia and the Carolinas and marching them or shipping them down to these other states. And all something like 1 million people were moved through these two processes. And maybe about 600,000 to 700,000 were moved by the slave traders. That's bigger in scale than the Atlantic slave trade to the United States, which was about 450 to 500,000 people. Now, all that cotton is grown, and a lot of that cotton is measured as it is picked. Now, you know about Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which processes the cotton, takes a seed out of the fibers. But for it to even get to the cotton gin, it has to be picked. And picking was the slowest part of the process. There's no mechanical cotton picker invented until the 1930s and 40s. Doesn't come into wide use until 1950s and 60s in some parts of the South. But cotton up to that point was picked by hand, and under slavery, it is picked by hand under the threat of force. And many planters and overseers measured the amount of cotton that each person picked during the day. And we know from the testimony of those who survived this process, whether they escaped to the north and published their accounts in autobiographies, or whether they were interviewed much later, that there were all kinds of techniques, tortures, and threats that were used to get people to pick more cotton on a daily basis. And a lot of it revolved around measuring the amount that had been picked at the end of the day. Sometimes people were whipped if they didn't make a certain quota. Even sometimes they would get a certain number of, like, one lash per pound is a sort of common thing that we hear. There were other tortures and threats that were made as well. And sometimes there were positive incentives. On Saturday and Sunday, for instance, extra picking might be incentivized by paying people a certain amount per pound or per 100 pounds picked. The result of this is that the amount of cotton that is picked per person per day of picking increases almost 4 times over between the early 1800s and 1860s. So this is an increase in efficiency of about 400%. There's a debate about how much of this is from those techniques and the measurement that I was just talking about, how much of it is from improved seeds and different soils and things like that. And probably the answer is both. But what we do know is that because enslaved people were enslaved, they had no protection from the slave owner who could use force, even deadly force, to compel labor. That was a crucial component of every single pound that did get picked. So whether the increase comes more from seeds or more from the techniques and measurement and threat and people's attempts to sort of innovate their own processes in order to get enough picked, and we know that those things were going on too, it is ultimately labor product that is produced by people who are doing that work under the threat of force, deadly force, in fact. And so this is very significant, though, because even as the world's demand for cotton was accelerating dramatically, the amount that American slavery as an institution could produce collectively through the labor of, by 1860, you've got almost 2 million enslaved people living in the cotton states. The amount that could be produced collectively could keep up with the growing demand. As more and more consumers around the world are getting used to wearing cotton clothes. Remember, this is kind of an innovative thing in the early 19th century. Up to that point, most people in the Western world had worn clothes made out of linen or wool. And now with cotton, they had a cheap, light, easily woven, readily printable, could hold all kinds of different designs and be produced in all kinds of different thicknesses and textures and so on. All of this makes it possible to stimulate new kinds of consumer demand and to offer consumers many more choices. So the demand for cotton keeps growing and growing. The number of people who are working in cotton factories who leave the farm and move to the city to live in a different kind of life, that grows dramatically over time. And it's possible because of the labor that's being done in South Carolina and Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi at the threat of the whip, at the threat of the weighing up at the end of the day. And because that labor is increasing in efficiency, the price of cotton stays low and in fact drops over time, almost in equal proportion to the increase in the efficiency of labor. And as I said, cotton is the major export of the United States. This is seen from the New Orleans levee, where tourists walk around today, but these are steamboats unloading cotton from upriver there, from Mississippi and Louisiana and Arkansas, and it would be transferred to seagoing ships and moved out to the ocean. The financial networks that develop to move this enormous amount of product around are a new thing in U.S. history and to a large extent in Western history. The financial networks that develop to finance the purchasing and the selling of enslaved people are also significant as well. And the consumer markets that are created in which the newly wealthy American slave owners and merchants and so on buy things, these are also significant as well. And they form an outlet for the products that are being made by the new factory system. In fact, cotton is made so efficiently that by the 1830s, it becomes obvious that every time there's a surge in production, there's a possibility that the price of cotton is going to drop dramatically because it's sort of outpacing consumer demand. So there's a new effort to find ways to get consumers to buy even more cotton. So this is an illustration from Godey's Lady's Book, which is a magazine that's first produced around 1840, right after the Panic of 1837, which is driven to a large extent because of the overproduction of cotton. And the purpose of this is to allow middle-class white women in the United States and in Britain to see what the latest fashions from Paris are. Fashions that use a huge amount of cotton cloth in many cases, so that they can then buy cotton cloth and either sew or have their servants or seamstresses sew these new fashions in order to, keep the pipeline of cotton flowing smoothly. Now, what I've been talking about is productive labor, but we could also talk about the other kinds of labor that are done outside of the working day, let's say, primarily by Black families and communities. And this is the labor of raising children up to adulthood. And the tragedy of this is that labor was converted into wealth by white families across the South. The new domestic slave trade, so-called, made it possible and profitable to do this. So almost as quickly as families in the Carolinas and Virginia and Maryland were raising their children, they were being sold to the New Orleans market, the Montgomery market, the Memphis market, where Nathan Bedford Forrest was a slave trader. They were being moved by the thousand, and large profits were being taken, so that by the middle of the 1850s, the price of an 18-year-old young man in New Orleans was about something like $1,600, which, depending on how you convert it to today's money, is anywhere between $75,000 and $250,000. So what you can see from the graph on the right is that by the time you get to the 1850s, the average productivity of enslaved people is increasing so rapidly that the price of enslaved people increases, even though the export price of cotton is basically flat. which is an interesting phenomenon. One wonders how long this could have gone on without the Civil War. Now, this kind of labor, this what you might call reproductive labor, the work that we all do in our own families. We obviously know about the work done by mothers to bear and to raise children, but entire families are raising their children, entire communities are raising their children, then as now. And we tend to think of this as labor that doesn't have a price, but it was turned into quantifiable monetary value by slave owning because every child raised to the age of 18 could potentially be sold on the market, or at the very least mortgaged to acquire more credit for whatever business purposes, to start a new merchant firm, to buy land, to send a child off to college at Princeton or what have you. All of these were things that white families did because they could either sell or use as collateral the young people that were raised to adulthood by Black families. And that value, that quantified monetary value on human bodies and human lives, represented between 10 and 20% of all the wealth in the U.S. in 1860. All right, so you can see what it says. It's more than all the stocks plus the bonds, plus the bank deposits, plus the value of factories combined. And the only thing that was worth more on the books, on the account books in the entire United States combined, was land. And of course, that land came from somebody too, right? And you can see that on the map on the right. This is land that was taken from Native American nations through processes of pretty coercive processes of treaty making, primarily during, but not only during the administration of Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. Much of this land was sought by the U.S. government because it was prime cotton land. And by the 1850s, the native peoples have been displaced from these lands in the Trail of Tears, and they had been settled. They have been cleared and settled for cotton plantations through the labor of enslaved African Americans who themselves had been displaced in their own lifetimes from the Carolinas and Virginia. Now, the thing that I'm really focusing on now is the early origins of what you might describe as racialized policing in the U.S., but also the processes of resistance to and organizing against the inequitable aspects of that. And you see a scene that we probably saw a lot of on the last on the news or on the internet in the last year. Here, specifically, we see Richmond, Virginia's famous Robert E. Lee statue, which was erected as a sort of white supremacist project in the 1890s by the Sons and Daughters of the Confederacy. And after 30 years of organizing and protests, it's now being taken down. But in the period between when it was announced that it would come down and the present, activists in Richmond have most nights been displaying these sort of projected pictures on it. And you see on the one hand, George Floyd, whose face became so familiar over the past year. But on the other hand, Harriet Tubman, who represents a much older kind of, but perhaps continuous process of organizing against racialized policing. The reason I say that is because slavery was not possible without a continuous process of policing. Slavery could not exist without holding people in place, without establishing boundaries beyond which they literally could not move their bodies without facing extreme danger. And the danger could come from slave patrols. We've become more familiar with that term. But one of the things I want to emphasize is that to a large extent, every white person in the American South and maybe in the United States was, during the time of slavery, deputized to act as a kind of policeman or policewoman of Black movement. This, again, helped make slavery possible. Now, just really quickly, this is a great source. If you've got questions about what kind of studies have been done about racialized disparities in policing and criminal justice outcomes, I can share this this link later. It's something that lots of sociologists and historians and criminologists have been studying and debating about. I'm primarily talking about before 1865. I may, return to what I see as some of the continuities after 1865 if we have time. But this is a great source for the post 1865 stuff. All right. Now, as Ms. Benjamin mentioned, with some other colleagues, I'm working on this this database of all the runaway slave ads, so-called, that we can find. And some of you may have seen things like this in history books, or I think in the movie Harriet, there's an image of one of these. But essentially, what these are advertisements that were placed above all in newspapers, describing individuals who are trying to free themselves from slavery, who've run away, who technically under the laws of the different states and of the United States at the time are therefore criminals, therefore fugitives from justice. And they are they're described and a reward is offered so that the readers of the newspaper and anyone they happen to talk to can be on the lookout for these individuals and be incentivized to seize them, to make, if you will, a citizen's arrest. But what we have to understand is that there were very few professional police forces in the United States before 1865. They only existed in a couple of cities. And actually, the first ones in the U.S. are in Charleston, and their specific purpose is to prevent enslaved people from wandering around after curfew and doing things that slave owners didn't want them to do. So in any case, you see this specific ad has a physical description, describes some of the supposed characteristics of behavior, and gives some indication of where he might be, where he might be going to, where you might find him, to give those whites who maybe are riding around or walking around in that area a suggestion that they look out for this guy. And a $50 reward, by the way, if you remember the kind of rough figures I gave as an equivalent for a price of $1,600 for a person, a $50 reward thus represents a lot. In present day money, it's in the thousands of dollars. Now, these things carried a lot of information in a small space, sometimes more, sometimes less, but they have a purpose, and that purpose led the folks who were placing these ads to try to pack as much information and as much realistic information as possible, as much information that would be useful in the real world in capturing people and recapturing them and forcing them back into slavery. And so we can definitely see bias in the descriptions, but we can also see some things about individual human beings that otherwise were not allowed to enter the written record, because enslaved people typically were not allowed to read and write. It was criminalized for them to read and write. They were not supposed to, in other words, be able to write down descriptions of themselves or things about their personality. They were not supposed to express themselves in the written word. And this isn't really their voice, right? But it is in some ways a description of their independent action, because they're literally running away. And so it's a record of policing, but it's also a record of self-liberation. So it's a very interesting thing for a historian, I think a lot of other people perhaps to look at. When did they start? They started with the first newspapers in the American colonies. Actually in Boston, the first one appears. Right after the first American newspaper starts to get printed in 1706, we start to see runaway slave ads. And they stopped. The last one in Richmond was printed in January 1865. And for those of you who have a chronology of the Civil War in your head, you'll realize that's only about 3 months before the end of the Civil War. Even when slave owners had to know that the end of the system was coming, they were still placing these ads. As to how many appeared over the years, we don't know. But we've got 30,000 in the database right now. And I think we're just scratching the surface. We might only have 20% of those that are out there. And here's the front page of the database. You can see we're trying to have a really broad outreach, including getting this into the classroom where it can be helpful for teachers. There's a section of lesson plans and descriptions of what's happened in the classroom when they've used these. Students often find that in contrast to the sort of, I don't know if the discussions of slavery and enslaved people in textbooks are always dehumanizing, but sometimes they're very abstract and they do not get you that sort of slice of life, immediate quality. That's something that sort of individualizes people can possibly do. I just want to show you a couple of these and then jump to the end. And this is actually not technically a runaway ad, but it's from the records of the Virginia colony back in 1673. This is right when racialized slavery, the enslavement of Africans, is starting to become the main labor system for producing tobacco in Virginia. Of course, slavery existed outside of the Virginia colony even before then. Other English-speaking colonies, the Spanish, the Portuguese, have already launched the slave trade from Africa. But the Virginia colony is the first mainland colony to adopt it on a large scale. And what you see here is that there was a guy named Will. He was quote unquote runaway Negro. He was an enslaved African, and he was out in the woods, and he saw in the local jail that there was another enslaved man who had been condemned to be executed, and he was waiting essentially for his execution date. And Will may have helped. It's not necessarily something he would confess to, but he may have helped, but certainly saw the condemned man break out. And at a certain point, he starts to help him and to hang out with him, basically, in the woods as they were hiding out, trying to evade recapture. And eventually, Will gets recaptured. And so what the officials of the Virginia colony do, basically, is they give him a kind of a carrot and a stick. You know, if you help us find this guy, you've been recaptured, he hasn't, we will reduce your sentence. We will reduce your punishment for being a runaway. And this is the early Virginia colony. If you see where Williamsburg is, that's actually across the river from Gloucester County, across the York River from Gloucester County, where these things seem to have been going on, where Will and this other runaway were hiding out in the woods before Will was recaptured. All right. So what we see getting developed out of ads at the same time, out of laws that are getting passed at the same time, is that the colony is drawing a line between indentured servants who are white and enslaved Africans who are black. They're essentially making race as we know it today, or at least something like what we know it today, come into being, right? It's not that people can observe differences, that they didn't know that different people had different cultural and religious backgrounds and practices depending on where they had come from and how they had grown up and so on and so forth. But what we see at this time in the late 1600s is this process of hunting down runaways gives white people new kinds of rewards and powers because the government is setting them up and makes life much more risky and dangerous for enslaved Africans who are seeking to free themselves. Because buried in the legalese of this law is a new permission for whites to kill runaway Africans if they can claim that the runaway African was resisting recapture. Now, it's not clear how much proof they need or don't need, or if they can just say, this is what was happening, that's why I killed him or her. And it quite possibly could be the latter. But on the other hand, it's still murder. It's still a crime if you kill a runaway white indentured servant, right? And so that's somebody who signed a contract to work And they often worked alongside enslaved Africans in the tobacco fields to work for a certain term of years. By this point, 5 years was common. And so this line is getting drawn between white and black, and it's a very meaningful line because it has a power of life and death, it has a power of freedom and bondage. And it gives whites who identify with other whites, rather than making common cause with people who sometimes economically might be in very similar circumstances, doing the same kind of labor next to each other, it gives those whites an incentive to identify first and foremost with other whites. At the same time, what happens, and we could see this with the case of Will, is that blacks who may come from very different places, Africa is an enormous and diverse continent, and there were already generations of people who've been born in the Americas as well, who have their own differences from those in Africa. At the same time, it groups all those people under one banner, one category. And what we can see from Will's case is that there's a hint here that what they build out of it is a kind of solidarity, kind of acknowledgement that they share the same fate. They're facing the same kind of threat of life and death. They're facing the same kind of policing. And they are the ones that can help each other. They are the only ones, ultimately, who they can trust. And so when you read through the 17th century language of this later entry in the Governor's Council's journal from 1673, what seems to have happened is that even though he's offered the opportunity to reduce his punishment, Will doesn't actually help them to catch the other runaway. And in fact, he's sentenced. He's going to be removed from jail and given, quote unquote, a good and well laid on whipping, put in the constable's hands of James City County, who's supposed to take him to the next county, which would be Gloucester County. And if it's like other sentences, that means he's going to be whipped once in each county before he's returned to his enslaver, who may do whatever to him. So Will is paying a price for not helping the government of Virginia to catch this condemned runaway. And whether he intended to pay it, whether he chose to pay it or was just inflicted on him, we can't really tell from the sources. But if it was possible for him to help them catch this guy, he didn't do it, which I think is a significant fact. If we go through U.S. history, we can find that other runaways become leaders in freedom, leaders in building new kinds of solidarity. We may be familiar with Crispus Attucks, who himself, depending on how you count it, may have been the first American killed in the American Revolution. He is the leader of the quote-unquote rioters who are shot at the Boston Massacre in 1770 by British soldiers. Attucks was in Boston under an assumed name, William Johnson, because he was actually illegal in Massachusetts. He had run away from a nearby town, and so he really could not make it too public that he was back in Massachusetts. 20 years later, he served as a sailor in the merchant ships ever since then. And only his closest friends knew that it was Crispus Attucks that fell that day, and they later told the authorities. But despite the efforts of people like Attucks, of course, slavery ends in only a few states after the American Revolution. And we find not only runaway advertisements placed by U.S. presidents, but we find that the U.S. Constitution in Article 4, Section 2, builds in a common commitment by the states of the new union to return runaways, to recapture and return runaways. We could think of this as a national policing system. Of course, that comes to be a source of great conflict between the northern and the southern states ultimately. But it is a commitment that had been made in the Constitution to extend this system in certain ways across the country so that a runaway wasn't even completely free and certainly not safe when they made it to the northern states. I'll just skip through these last couple, but they do show you the amazing diversity of stories in the runaway ads. Here's a guy who was moved from South Carolina in the domestic slave trade, in all likelihood to New Orleans, runs away in New Orleans, and he keeps popping up in New Orleans at dances held by free people of color. So free people of African descent in New Orleans, disguises himself in fancy dress, sometimes in women's clothing even, and they can't catch him. So clearly people are helping him to hide out and to escape the authorities. And it hints at some of the fascinating stories of self-liberation that are under the surface of these ads. Some of these are kind of famous. This is the ad for Harriet Jacobs, who publishes one of the few pre-Civil War books published by an African-American woman. She hid out in the attic of her grandmother's house in Edenton, North Carolina. Her grandmother was a free Black woman who sold cakes in the local market, and she hid in the attic of her grandmother's house for several years because she was trying to escape the threat of sexual assault by her slave owner. Occasionally, she had 2 children, and occasionally her grandmother would get to spend some time with these children and would walk them by the attic where she could look out a very, very narrow vent and not be caught, but still get to see her children as they were growing. Eventually, she was smuggled onto a ship and made it up to Boston. And one more, Araminta Ross, Minty, who we know to history as Harriet Tubman, and this sort of renaming was pretty common. And she was pursued by the state of Maryland as a sort of radical threat to the system for many years after her escape and her, multiple times coming back into the South to help people get away. I think if we think about it, and we ask what motivated someone like Harriet Tubman, we don't know what motivated Will back in 1673, but it could quite possibly be very similar impulses, very similar commitments and beliefs. The understanding that the people that she was helping, that their lives had value, value that couldn't be measured by the prices for which people were sold, by the rewards that could be gained by those who helped to recapture runaways from slavery. Value that was so significant that Harriet Tubman was willing to risk her life again and again and again to help people get out of slavery. And Will was willing to accept torture, in fact, if that was the price of not helping the state of Virginia execute the African man who, as far as we know, was never recaptured. Thinking about how this feeds into systems of policing and incarceration after 1865 is a complicated thing. And I think I'm going to just try to telescope that really quickly by saying that things are very different now, and yet they bear the impact of the past and the sort of ongoing belief that many people may hold and that many systems incorporate, which is that the movement of people of African descent in the United States is something that needs to be controlled in various ways. And we see that in the system of Jim Crow. But we can also see that in less obvious and more subtle kinds of segregation and surveillance and observation, whether it's the 911 call that's absurd and clearly driven by racial prejudice that gets captured with a camera phone and gets blown up on social media, or on things that are more subtle, like the way that police patrols are assigned and what they're assigned to do, which many would argue sometimes reflects this sort of unspoken desire to control the movement of African Americans through space. So while this is 2021 is obviously very different from 1861 or 1865, and we have professional police forces now. This idea that it is one of the jobs of white people to keep an eye on Black people is something that perhaps not every white person holds that, to be sure, but it is something that has a really, really deep set of roots in American history. It's fundamentally grounded ultimately in the desire of powerful people to control people in such a way that they can be enslaved, right? Because again, to go back to the earliest point I made, you cannot make people slaves unless you can force them to stay in one place and do the labor that you desire for them to do. You can't count them as wealth. You cannot extract productive labor. You cannot extract their sort of family reproductive labor, if you will, from them. And that commitment wasn't just one that slave owners fulfilled. It was also one in which they were supported by the larger white population. And if you look at the Constitution, that commitment was written literally right into the Constitution of the United States. And it doesn't fundamentally change shape until emancipation in 1865. And again, it may have some significant after effects today. So let me wrap up there. I'm going to stop sharing just in the interest of getting us to some discussion time. And I'll just say thanks again for giving me the opportunity to talk about some of this work. If you want to go to freedomонthemove.org and register, you can participate by helping to transcribe some of these ads, helping to pull some of the information out of them so we can know more about the people who are seeking self-liberation from slavery. It's an ongoing project, and we're trying to take it into as many as many types of forums and opportunities as possible. Because to my mind, these are the folks, not Robert E. Lee, who are the ones I think with the most important lessons from the American past to teach us in order to have a more just and equal future. So I'll close there, and thanks again.
Dr. Babbitt, that was good. I appreciate it. I was scribbling notes here as you were sharing, and certainly people were making some comments and even posing questions in the chat on a couple of the platforms. So again, just tremendous perspective. So what I want to do as we start the Q&A is, you've referenced a few of these things already, but I want to zero in on one subject in particular from the book, The Half Has Never Been Told. You talked about the concept of hands in the book. And and quite honest with you, there were so many parts of the book that were revolutionary and transforming. That was probably one of the most revolutionary and impactful chapters, because I can remember my grandfather, who passed away in 2018. He worked on a farm for a particular white family for probably 60 plus years. And I can remember being 9, 10 years old and hearing my grandfather have conversations with the farm owners. And the conversation was around needing more hands, needing more. I can vividly remember that. But it wasn't until I read your book that it made sense. And it was just like, literally, I sat on my couch. I probably remember 20, 30 minutes and just couldn't read anymore. Just like, hold on for a second. I remember this like it was yesterday. Could you take a moment and elaborate on the concept of hands for us from your book?
Yeah, I can try. I think one of the things is we kind of know what those landowners meant, right? You want to get more sort of force of production, right, to apply it to a particular problem. And and yet it's kind of an interesting thing that we don't say we need more people, we need more workers, we need more hands, right? And so there's a kind of a disembodiment, right? Or at least a depersonalization that's potentially implied by that. I don't know what they were thinking at that moment. I can't say, but that's a potential implication. You start to see slave owners talking about hands, hands, hands all the time in their correspondence. And there is, I would say, an upsurge of that as you get into the era of cotton. So you move out of the era of tobacco and grain and rice, which still continue to be made in the South, but they're not the main commodity. And cotton starts to take over after the 1790s, and the activity, literally the activity of cotton pickers' hands is the bottleneck of production. That's the key point of production. That's the limiting factor, because the cotton growers found out really quickly that a quote unquote hand could raise significantly more cotton than they could pick. Picking was just the hardest, slowest part. So they get really focused on the activity of hands in other ways as well. But for me, it had a different resonance, and I tried to get into this book because, there's a whole theological understanding of power and the different powers of people and of God and other forces too, which says that there's a difference between right-handed power and left-handed power. Right-handed power is basically like, your stern, forceful version of God that says you can't do this, and you must not do that, and you must do that. And maybe that's the power that smites the people, the Egyptians, with plagues and things like that, and forces apart the Red Sea. But there's also left-handed power, which is the still small voice, right? And is the things that the people are supposedly weak, the stumbling blocks, right? That they are able to accomplish, often by working together, right? Or by listening in the dark to what God is saying to them. And so, it's a thing throughout history that, you have powerful states, and then you have the small people of history, the peasants, the enslaved, and so on, who are trying to figure out a way to survive when faced by that right-handed power of the state. And so I tried to emphasize as well in the book that, this force that was getting applied to people to force them as hands to pick cotton was something that they also tried to counteract with the kind of more left-handed kinds of power that they brought to bear on the problem. How do we survive? How do we survive not just as individuals? How do we survive as families, as communities, as a larger sense of people who share the same fate and therefore are in solidarity with each other?
Oh, got it. And to that end, I've got one more question. I'm gonna go here to a few of the questions that were asked. The pushing system.
Mm-hmm.
And, you talk about right-handed power and left-handed power and so forth, and how those who were enslaved, were looking for ways to sort of course, get by or get over on that system, because, again, they knew what the consequences were if they did not meet those quotas. And you referenced, that, briefly in your presentation, about the growth of cotton production. And of course, I was writing down notes here about supply and demand. So my one, certainly you can bring the pushing system into it, but just talk briefly for a moment about the economy of cotton, because we hear about cotton in the South. People hear about it, and they may hear some numbers, every now and then. But I don't think the majority of people really understand the economy of cotton in terms of dollars and cents, and what that really, and you were referencing it in your graphic about, I think it was between 18, I can't remember what the dates were, but I wrote it down. But you were talking about, but anyway, I won't go and try to re-elaborate on that. But just for a moment, talk about cotton as it relates to economy, as it relates to economic strength that helped drive capitalism, because people think, oh, that's cotton, that's agriculture, that's farming. That it was a marginal part of our history. It didn't really help America become, what it is today. And I think history tells a different story.
Yeah, I mean, oil is just, dinosaur juice that you suck out of the ground with a straw, and copper ore is just red dirt that you melt down until it gives you some metal. But these sort of basic materials are crucial to the modern economy. We know that. And cotton had a similar role in the 19th century, particularly before the American Civil War, in the world economy that oil had in the late 20th century. And with the information age, oil is not as important, but it's still probably the single most important commodity in
Right.
the world market. In the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, the U.S. South was Saudi Arabia plus Iran plus Iraq plus Nigeria plus Venezuela plus Russia plus Kuwait plus the UAE in terms of the amount of the world market that they controlled, of the world's most important commodity. And that's crucial. And it's also crucial because it's not really clear that you could have run an industrial revolution where the main product that's being made in the factories, at least at first, is textiles, is cloth, without cotton, right? Because wool has there are a lot of technical problems with making machines that can spin and weave wool mechanically. And those technical problems were solved later than the ones about cotton, and based to a large extent on what people learn from making machines from cotton. But here's the problem. Let's say it had to be with cotton, but Britain and the northern U.S., you can't grow cotton there. You have to grow it somewhere, right? And it turned out that ultimately most of it was grown in the southern United States, and is grown in the southern United States because you had a growing forced labor force, right, who could be coerced under the laws of the land. And you had a kind of open frontier that the national state, the United States government, was committed to keeping open and keeping expansion going by taking land away from native people and keeping land cheap for the slave owner. So you had all of these ingredients that came together to create an enormous and really an at-demand amount of cheap cotton for the Industrial Revolution. So could you have had the Industrial Revolution without cheap cotton? I don't know. I have not been, in my time machine into these alternate universes, right? I just can look at the historical record and say, in this universe we live in, cheap cotton was absolutely essential to the Industrial Revolution. Cheap cotton came from the labor of enslaved African Americans.
Wow. So, well, I mean, every time you say something, I keep thinking about 3 or 4 other questions, but I'm going to move over to some of their questions. So, like, well, Marcus did answer any of our questions. Well, to that end, is actually going in the same lines. Sean Glover asked, what's the impact of free labor as a foundation, what is the impact of free labor as a foundation of or for America's economy? And you kind of was already answering that, but if there was anything you want to add to that question, by all means.
Yeah, I think, we can probably quantify if we wanted to what it would have cost in wages, right? And there's a guy named Jordan Anderson who, during the Civil War, he escaped slavery in Tennessee. He and his wife and his kids end up in Ohio, and he gets a letter after the Civil War from his old enslaver saying, "Look, the farm is falling apart. I really need your help. Can you come back and work for me?" And he writes, and he says, "All right, I'll come back if you pay me what you owe me." And then he adds it all up, his labor and his wife's labor. And then I think he put some interest on it, for 30 years of labor. And it's way more than this guy could have ever paid, right? Much less right after the Civil War. And then he adds other things like Um, can you guarantee that you and your sons are not going to try to assault my daughters the way that your son tried to assault my wife? Can you make sure that there are people around who will take the gun away from you when you try to shoot me, like you tried to shoot me and the Union soldier happened to come along and take your gun away? And he puts all these other things in there. You can find this this letter on the internet. It's been reproduced a number of times. And he spells his first name Jourdan, Jordan Anderson. But if you multiply that, right, there were 4 million enslaved people at the beginning of the Civil War. And some demographic historians calculate something like 10 million, I think it's at least 10 million people ultimately lived some part of their lives in slavery in the United States. And if you could take those numbers and multiply them by Jordan Anderson's 30 years of labor, right? And then if we add interest from 1861 to 2021, you get a very large number that may break your calculator.
Wow. So yeah, I put that in the chat for people to pull up and contextualize, because you've referenced this on a few occasions, and it goes back to a couple of the questions. I'm actually combining 2 questions here in regard to this. And the question is, I've heard that the North won the war, but the South told the story.
What are your thoughts on that? Yeah, that's very well put. I agree. You're right. I mean, here's the thing, the North stuck with Reconstruction for a little while, right? But by 1877, it was over. And of course, Reconstruction was the attempt to suppress the power of the old slave owners to sort of dictate the future of the South, and the insistence that formerly enslaved, now free African Americans should have the rights of citizens. And there were lots of limits to Reconstruction even while it was going on, but it was certainly better than what came after. By 1877, the North had sort of given up pushing back against the Ku Klux Klan and the militias and things like that. And so in the wake of that, essentially the North, the white North tries to reunify with the white South. And there's a price to that. The price is essentially letting the Southerners dominate the way that this story gets told. It's sort of hard to imagine a reunification process after a civil war in which the losing side commemorates itself much more loudly and much more publicly than the winning side. But that's what you had in the context of U.S. history. As you could even go further, you could say, what happened when America's universities start to become world class in the late 1890s, and they start to do things like create departments of history and PhD programs where you train people how to be professional historians. Well, Southern whites flock to those programs, and they become some of the first historians, and they tell exactly that kind of pro-Southern story. One of them even goes on to become the president of Princeton, and then the governor of New Jersey, and then the president of the United States, and that's Woodrow Wilson, right? And so he's the guy who presides over the 50-year reunion of the Battle of Gettysburg in 1913 as president, and he says in his speech, in effect, the debate is over, the disagreement is over, the Civil War was probably a mistake, but we're glad all us whites are back together. And I'm paraphrasing quite a bit, but that is the meaning of the president going there to give a speech of reunion when he's a Southern president or president from the South who's written this historiography in which Reconstruction was this horrible mistake, right? And what came after has been sort of a return of white people to ruling the South.
Wow. Dr. Baptist, I mean, the more and more I study, I've been studying this area, for about 7 to 10 years from an economic standpoint. And the more and more I research, and of course, now there's a lot of, thank goodness, there's a lot more data available, right? There's a lot more information available than what was available before. But I've had, here we are, we're in Charlotte, North Carolina. We're in the South. I was raised in South Carolina. And there's some, and I tell people all the time, there's some amazing white folks that I know. I'm talking about amazing, great folks. I mean, who are just, they've been an asset to our family. We've been an asset to their family, so on and so forth. And I bring this conversation up because in those relationships, most of the time when I bring this conversation up, the conversation gets kind of tense, but I have to bring it up to help them understand. And not because I know it all, nor knows I don't, but I'm just saying to have a conversation. The narrative that you just mentioned about the Civil War not being about slavery, the narrative that the Civil War and not being about the expansion of slavery into the Western territory, just that entire narrative for me is like, it's like Hollywood 101, right? It's like, because when you look at any basis of history, there is very little evidence that the Civil War was about anything other than the rights of slave states to hold on to their slaves and to expand that slavery system to these new states being added to the Union. When you read the succession documents from the governors who are succeeding from the Union, this is all they're talking about.
Right.
And so to that end, from an academic standpoint, as an academic and as a historian, how do you view that, for the lack of a better term, how do you view that whitewashing of history and even that mishandling of history as a historian and as an academic? I mean, how do you view that personally?
Well, I think it's very unfortunate. And it leads me to ask the question, what is it that they're trying to protect? What is it that is the perceived cost of saying, yeah, the Civil War was about slavery, secession was about slavery, the Confederacy was a bunch of people who broke their oaths to the Union to set up a new country because they felt that slavery wasn't going to be protected in the country they were trying to leave. And so what's the cost? What's the cost of saying, yes, that's what happened, right? And that, I think, is an interesting question. I don't know exactly what people would say if they were asked that. What is one thing one is giving up when one makes that kind of concession?
Right. I've said this to a few people, and it always gets some interesting remarks. But there are many well-meaning Southern whites whose heroes told a false story. America, in my estimation, there are several things, but America, as every country has a hero complex. Every country. Because that's what makes a country great, right? That's what gives people the ability to buy into the military, buy into fighting for the flag, buy into the historicity of that particular nation, because you have to have some type of, I think I've heard some people say, some type of mythology, some type of mythical history that kind of makes the nation greater than what it is, so that people can buy into it. And we know the Greeks and the Romans did that better than anybody, in that sense. But I'm bringing that to this present conversation because that type of narrative of America's dark history and the reuniting of the North and the South, to me, it was necessary. It was a necessary evil, because here we have Black people during Reconstruction are now taking up political office. They're now running for mayors and governors and senators and House of Representatives. They're now endeavoring to acquire land, cultivate land, so on. So you have these Black people who 2 years ago you consider them property, and now 2 years later they're going to be my representative in the Senate. Oh no. That just can't happen. So I'm saying all of that to say that what your book did, and there are people who've asked for the book, and we've dropped that link in the chat. But what your book did for me was it helped broaden the concept, because people think that there was this economic break between the old world and the new world. And I don't believe history bears that out. And I also, when we look at, to your point earlier about Jim Crow and what happened in the South and the growth of America during that time, from a housing standpoint, from a land standpoint, from a academic institution standpoint, we're going to keep Black people away from all of this. And then because of the Civil Rights Act in '64, we feel as if, wow, we've done our due diligence, and man, we've elected President Barack Obama, which we've heard some politicians say that we paid for the sin of slavery by electing, President Barack Obama. I won't even go there, but I'm saying, I said too much, but I say all of that to get to this question. The question is, this is from Destiny, actually. She actually had to go to class. She had a 1:30 class. So she's finishing up her senior year. But here's her question is this. Considering the use of enslaved Africans as sources of capital in early America, as well as slavery's undeniable role in the rise of capitalism, in what ways would you say race is still systemically present today?
Yeah.
That's a non-coerced, non-coaxed question, by the way. That's the question of an 18-year-old senior in high school.
Yeah, well, I think maybe there are a lot of people that could answer that question, and some of it is, and this is the challenge of the moment where you have anti-racist programs that are being set up by different companies and institutions and so on. Because on the one hand, some of this is in some of the legacy is in behavior, and the belief that it sometimes is it's deep below the rational parts of people's brains, right? It's been inculcated in them, whether by family or by what they see and what they don't see and how they see people acting. It's the belief that there's still a responsibility for white people to control where Black people go and what they do, right? And so that plays out in all kinds of ways, right? But I referred to like those sort of 911 call tapes, that or videos that every so often are making their way around social media. But some of it's a good deal more subtle. And I know that there are a lot of these programs that are trying to reduce people's implicit bias, at least make them aware of it. But there's a lot of work to do. But then there are the structural, right? The structural issues, and you alluded to some of those. What is the impact of generation after generation of exclusion from attaining wealth, of generation after generation of denial of the opportunity for people to do the different things that help them to obtain social capital, whether it's educational credentials or something else besides that. So what does that do? What does it do when you have a system that seems to be more open for everybody except one particular group, right? And that I think is much more systemic. It isn't just quantifiable. Some of it is quantifiable. Some of it is measurable. Some of it is, is about lost opportunities for generation upon generation as well. And
right.
and that might be tougher to quantify.
Yeah, as we get ready to finish here, which this has been great, by the way. And if you have any questions for me, by all means, which I don't know what those questions could be, but if there were something, then by all means. But I think about institutions, and I think about supply chains, because when you were referencing earlier, you were mentioning supply and demand, and you showed the graphic of, I think it was a Louisiana mill. I think that was what the graphic that you showed. Was that correct? There was a picture of the big mills and people were moving cotton back and forth.
The steamships, yeah, the steamships that were bringing the cotton down, yeah.
Right. And so I was just thinking about all of the supply chain necessary to make all of that happen, and all of the money that's needed, that moves hands, that it's required to make that happen. The demand for cotton clothes, the demand for factory workers, demand for financing, demand for slaves, demand for logistics. I mean, you've got all of these demands and of course, supply and demand economy that creates this mass movement of wealth on the shoulders and on the backs of Black people. So, and I don't remember if you said this or not. And I've listened to your book once on Audible, and I've read it once in paperback. And of course, both of those were back in 2015. I don't recall you saying anything about this, and I'm certainly not asking this from a political standpoint. I'm just asking from a general academic historian standpoint. What is your historical perspective of the concept of reparations?
Yeah. It's a question that comes up often, and it's something that hopefully we can think about as a society, right? And I think if you were to work out the numbers, and also like Jordan Anderson is talking about the productive labor, right? But he's talking about some other stuff as well, and maybe Destiny's question kind of got at that a little bit too. Then there's the amount of financing that the U.S., white people in the U.S. collectively as a society are able to get, right? They are able to get Western European capital to launch all kinds of projects, in no small part because of that gigantic stream of cotton that's flowing back to the old world. And because they have a political system that at least up until 1860 guaranteed that you could collect on those debts because you could collect on the labor of slaves, right? And if worse got to worse, the slave owner who was indebted could always sell the slaves because that Louisiana market was right there. So, so a real accounting, right, of all of that, and then you put it in, like I said, you put it into the calculator and you add compound interest for 160 plus years, almost 160 years since 1865, coming up on that. And there's not enough money in the economy, right? There's not enough capital in the U.S. to pay that off, I suspect, right? So I think one of the first things that has to happen for reparations to happen is for people to understand that fact, right? That whatever you're getting asked to pay, right, it's cents on the dollar. It's the unjust steward situation, right?
Right.
So, right, be happy if somebody's writing your debt down, right? And it's a hard thing for people to come to when they're used to thinking of themselves as the good people in history, right? And as the people who are inevitably going to win in history, and they're going to come out on top in each situation, right? It's very hard for people to accept that. You look at the process that Germany went through, right, after World War II. The first generation did not want to accept that what had happened had actually happened in terms of the deep complicity of them, those individuals and those families in genocide, right? And it's only a generation or two later that younger people began to really press their society. Look, you really have to face up to this. Well, we've waited way more generations than that to really have a widespread reckoning among whites about the role of slavery in U.S. history. All along, there have been people, including white people, who've been trying to push that. But I think among whites, I think it's fair to say that they've been a minority. And maybe we're in a different situation. And maybe in that situation, whites can start to say, all right, let's try to negotiate something, because there's not enough money to pay, right? So let's think about how we could legitimately eliminate some of the wealth gaps in the present day. How could we shift some of the power of institutions and the leadership, not just the leadership of institutions, but the ownership of institutions, right? So, I talk about things like churches and universities and HBCUs and the kinds of community-run partnerships that could be created, right? But there's also a need for families to get money. And households to get money if you're really going to change these wealth gaps that we have in our society.
Wow.
And it would be a bargain. It would be a bargain for white people if they would face up to the the reality, but they have to face up to the reality first.
Right. You're right. I have a good white friend of mine, and I say that on purpose. His name is Sam Stevens. I call his name on purpose because he and I have some very courageous conversations about a lot of things, and he would definitely be who most people would consider, and he would probably consider himself to be a conservative as well in the political sense. But he said something. He said, Marcus, he said, someone said it to me like this: imagine if for 100+ years you're playing a Monopoly game, and one group of people get to go around as many times as they want and collect $200 and just keep collecting $200. They just keep collecting $200. And then the people who manage the game now finally say, okay, black people, you can now participate in the game. Now, because you can now participate doesn't change anything about the 160 years that happened previously and the economic advantage that one group of people was able to have. And now you're saying, okay, compete within this game. And what I have contended is when we look at the issues of systemic racism, white privilege, poverty, etc. Very, very quick story along those lines. I had my wife and I were buying a house, and we were finishing buying our current house, and the closing was delayed because there was now all of this sudden this legal issue that we had to resolve. And I'm like, hold on for a second. We're at the closing table. We're 2 days. What are we talking about? Credit reports have been run, bank accounts have been checked. All this stuff has been done. What are we talking about? So, at any rate, it was what it was. And this is right on the border of North Carolina. We were buying a home in York County. And from July 1st until September the 8th, I ended up meeting with anywhere from 12 to 15 people who were all a part of York County, lawyers, magistrate's office, so on and so forth, trying to resolve this issue. Hired an attorney, paid him this money. They're trying to figure out all that's happening. They can't figure out what's going on with this. And each person that I talked to, none of them look like me. Each person I talked to say, well, Mr. Benjamin, we can't help you. I said, hold on, how can't you help me? This document is from your court. This document has your judge's name on it. This document has this attorney's name on it. How can you tell me and the attorney I'm paying for that you can't help us when these are all the legal documents? How do we resolve this? When did it go to court? I mean, who brought the judge? I mean, and Dr. Baptist, this happened 3 years ago. The last lady that I spoke to, she said, come in and see me. I drove down right here in York, South Carolina, drove down to York to the county office. And here's what she says to me. Mind you, this is all of July, all of August, and this is now September the 8th. She said, Marcus, I apologize to you for what these other people have done. She said, because this could have been resolved with 2 phone calls and an email back in July. She made the 2 phone calls, sent the email. Within 24 hours, that matter was gone. And she was just so, and of course, I'm irate, because I've spent thousands of dollars on lawyers, thousands of dollars on hotels. Because again, I mean, it's just all of this stuff's going on. Because again, we moved out of one house, we're closing another one. That house is gone. We're closed. And I said to the lady, I said, ma'am, I have a college education. I have a master's in business. If I did not have my level of education and persistence, my family and I would have went a different direction. All because about 13 people, unfortunately, who were all white women, unfortunately, she made 2 phone calls, Dr. Baptist. She said, Mark, all you do is She called them. We needed this information. We need this information. Here's the email within 20. I mean, it was done like that. And so when I think about situations like that, I'm just compounding that in today's environment, but taking it back to the 1940s with redlining, right? Taking it back to the 1950s and 60s before fair housing legislation was passed. And it wasn't even until 1988 that it was even enforced. But I guess I'm bringing that story up to come to your point about when you compound all of that, there's not enough money in the economy. I mean, there's not enough money in the economy, but the awareness of that reality, the awareness of what that absence of wealth opportunity created and the generations of wealth that should have been passed down or could have been passed down, that could have, as you said earlier, paid for college, that could have paid for medical expenses, that could have kept the bankruptcy from happening, so on and so forth. When you compound that, what does that number look like? So yeah, it should be an awareness that causes a bargaining. How do we drive this number down, right? How do we negotiate? How do we negotiate this number and say, you know what, let's come with the number? And so I want to give you, I guess, final words. We've had a great conversation. I trust that it's been great on your end as well. I know based on the comments I'm seeing on the various platforms that people are definitely engaging. But any final remarks or comments from your perspective as we close out today?
Well, I would just say, and I know we came back to wealth and debt, and I think, that's where a lot of the conversation is going to be until and unless something happens. And just on that point, I would ask people to take a look at the ideas that have been advanced by Sandy Darity, who's an economist at Duke, and Derek Hamilton, who's an economist at the New School for Social Research in New York, and they argue that one way to get something like reparations started is for the U.S. government to create something that they call baby bonds, which it's essentially a bond that's issued to a child when they're born, and the wealth of it, or the principle of it, is inversely proportional to family wealth, right? And so it's not even necessarily identified exclusively with African Americans. But as we know, there's a phenomenon that's driven by this whole history that we've been talking about, where you can have college educated African American families where people are, they're doing everything they're supposed to do, and they still have less family wealth than high school educated whites who, they're the third generation of homeowners and things like that in their family. And so this is a very common phenomenon. And so inevitably its effect would work more strongly in favor of those who've been systematically excluded, not just African Americans, but disproportionately African Americans. And so this wouldn't be redeemable, I think, until people were 18, and then only for college, and then maybe a little later for doing things like starting businesses and things like that. And so that's a relatively cheap entry level reparations project that could start to shift the wealth gap if Darity and Hamilton are correct. So I would point people to that as a sort of concrete possibility that could happen. Right. There's a lot of other things, equalizing paying essentially some reparations for the lack of funding from the USDA for Black farmers over generations, which has been tremendously harmful for Black people in rural America. I
just read a report about that. You're right.
Yeah, there's a lot of good things that could happen if there is the political will to make them happen, and it can't just come from African Americans. That's the thing. But I think it is going to have to be advanced and pushed by African Americans.
Right. Thank you very much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, the website is on the screen. No matter what platform you're on, it's freedomonthemove.org. And it's a project that Dr. Baptist, an aggressive project that he and others are engaged in. And there's opportunities for you to volunteer, to support, et cetera, that are found there on that website. So we want to challenge you and encourage you to go to freedomonthemove.org and find a place to make an impact and make a difference. We're definitely going to do it ourselves. And the second thing is, the reason why we have this conversation today as we close out Black History Month is because, one, at the end of the day, we all desire the same things for our family. We want security, we want prosperity, we want well-being and opportunity. We want those basic things, for our families. But unfortunately, America's dark history has made that desire more accessible and significantly more accessible historically and in the present for white Americans as opposed to Black Americans. And I want to challenge you that your experience in America isn't everybody's experience in America. There's so many people who think and say, well, slavery isn't this, or systemic racism isn't this, or white privilege isn't this. And I always tell people, remember, your experience isn't everybody's experience. And your experience with an African American isn't all African Americans' experience. There is a history and there is a destiny, and it involves us coming to a clear understanding of where we came from so that we can systemically address those things that are present in our institutions today. And we wanted Dr. Baptist to be a part because, again, I feel as if his book is one of the most important books for Black and white people involved in this conversation to read. I've said it for the past 4 or 5 years, and I'm going to keep on saying it. I believe it's one of the most important books for you to have on your bookshelf. And so to that end, Dr. Baptist, thank you for taking time to be with us. We know you had some class scheduled this morning and so forth, and you took out time this afternoon, and we really appreciate you jumping on for the last 2 hours.
No, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, and thanks for hosting these conversations.
Sounds good. We look forward to the future. I appreciate your time.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.